Welcome to the channel. If you enjoy realistic survival stories set during the collapse of civilization, you're in the right place. Here, every story is grounded in real locations, real systems, and believable human decisions made when everything starts to fall apart. Before the story begins, take a moment to support the channel by pressing the like button and subscribing. It helps the channel grow and allows me to keep bringing you long-form immersive stories like this one. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. Now, get comfortable, use headphones if you can, and let's begin. Freight stopped first. Not the passenger trains, those had been thin for years in this part of the country, but the long, heavy stuff. The kind that shook the ground before you ever saw it. The kind that kept whole towns awake when the wind was wrong. The kind that made the air smell like hot steel, creosote, and brake dust. When those trains stopped running, people still tried to explain it like it was normal. "Strike," my neighbor said, standing in the hallway of our apartment building with his phone up like it was a flashlight and a shield at the same time. "It's a strike, or a cyber thing. They'll sort it out." "Fuel," someone else said. "They're rationing. They're keeping supplies for the coast." I didn't answer either of them because I'd been in logistics long enough to know what a real stop looked like. A strike still has movement. A disruption still has reroutes. Even during the worst weather, you get something. One train limping through, a maintenance engine, a crew truck, a radio call. This was nothing. A hard stop, like a power switch. I'm not a railroader. I wasn't born into it. Didn't have an uncle with a lantern story. Didn't have a collection of timetable books. But I work with systems. I read patterns. I know what a supply chain looks like when it's sick. My name is Ethan Klein, 34 years old. Before everything folded in on itself, I was a network technician for a contractor that serviced industrial clients, warehouses, cold storage buildings, a couple municipal sites, and occasionally, the kind of places you only notice when they stop working. I did cameras, access control panels, fiber runs, battery backups, and emergency communications. I spent my days climbing ladders with a tool bag that always wanted to swing into my knees. My biggest problem used to be whether the building manager would actually unlock a closet on time. Then I started getting jobs canceled with no explanation, one after another, like dominoes. Clients stopped answering. Invoices stopped getting paid, my boss stopped making eye contact. And on the third morning that the freight line beyond the river didn't run, I woke up to a phone alert with words that didn't belong together. Statewide public safety notice. Avoid close contact. Unpredictable behavior reported. Shelter in place if possible. It sounded like a bad flu announcement, except for the last part. Unpredictable behavior. That's not how officials talk about illness. That's how they talk about people. I sat on the edge of my bed with my phone in my hand and listened. No distant horns, no tire noise, no early shift traffic. Just a kind of quiet that felt manufactured, as if the city had been told to hold its breath. I checked the map apps, red dots clustered on the highways like a rash. I checked social media. Short videos, shaky and clipped, people screaming in parking lots. A guy on a sidewalk with his arms out like he was trying to stop someone from walking forward, and then he was knocked down like he weighed nothing. A woman behind the camera crying, saying, "He doesn't even look sick," over and over. I watched one clip twice because I didn't want to believe what I was seeing. A man in a grocery store, no blood, no obvious injury, just wide eyes and a stiff way of moving, pushed a cart through a line of people like it was a battering ram. Someone grabbed his shoulder and he turned fast and bit down on the person's forearm with an animal certainty. The sound of it wasn't loud, but the reaction was immediate. The camera shook, dropped, caught the ceiling lights. Then the clip ended. I sat there and felt my mouth go dry. Infected. That's what people started calling them almost right away. It's a clean word, a safe word. A word you can say on the radio without sounding like you're in a movie. By noon, the news was half official statements and half empty airtime. It was like the anchors were waiting for someone to hand them a script that never arrived. The city put up a message board on the highway signs. Short commands, no comfort. Stay home. Avoid crowds. Time =, 0.6s. Call 911 for life-threatening emergencies only. And then, around 2 in the afternoon, the power flickered. Not a full outage, just enough to reset the microwave clock in my kitchen. The building's hallway lights blinked. Somewhere down the corridor, someone yelled. I went to the window. A few blocks away, toward the industrial district, I saw a column of smoke that wasn't the soft gray of a chimney. This was thick, black, and it climbed straight up like it had purpose. I stood there too long, trying to place the location, when my phone buzzed with a text from my sister. Maya, you okay? Don't go outside. Don't open the door for anyone. I started typing back, but before I could send it, another message popped up. This one from my boss. Ray, if you can get out, don't come to the shop. Phones are being monitored. Take cash, take water. That's when my stomach turned. Ray didn't do drama. Ray didn't even do optimism. If he was texting like that, it meant he'd seen something that made normal language feel stupid. I needed a place that wasn't my apartment. Not because I didn't like my apartment. It was fine. 3rd floor, decent locks. But it was in a building with too many people. And in a situation like this, the biggest threat isn't always the infected. It's panic. It's hunger. It's the moment when someone decides your supplies look better than theirs. I needed somewhere with barriers, multiple exits, and the kind of layout that let you move without being seen. My mind went where it always went when things got bad. Infrastructure. I grabbed my tool bag, because it's what I did when I needed to feel competent, and I started adding what mattered. A headlamp, 2 spare battery packs, a compact pry bar, electrical tape, zip ties, a small first aid kit, a multi-tool, a bottle of water, then 2 protein bars, a lighter, a cheap handheld radio I'd bought for storms and never really used, my old work badge, useless but familiar. Then I opened the drawer where I kept the one thing I hoped I'd never need. A compact pistol, legal, maintained, and honestly more comforting as a weight than as a plan. I'd taken a safety course. I'd been to a range. I wasn't pretending I was something I wasn't, but I also wasn't going outside empty-handed. I packed it with 2 magazines, tucked it into a holster that felt suddenly too serious, and pulled on a jacket with enough pockets to matter. On the way out, I hesitated at my closet, then grabbed my steel-toe work boots. If you're going to run in something that won't turn your feet into a problem. I stepped into the hallway. The building smelled like someone had burned toast and then tried to hide it with cleaning spray. Doors were shut. A TV somewhere played a news theme song on repeat, like the channel had frozen. I moved quietly, my tool bag strap biting into my shoulder. The stairwell was crowded on the 2nd floor, a woman with a stroller, a teenager with a backpack. 2 men arguing in low, sharp voices about whether to go to a relative's house outside town. Someone had a chap. No, I caught myself, because my brain was already slipping into shorthand. Someone had a long kitchen knife, held awkwardly like they'd watched a video and didn't trust it. I didn't join them. I slid down the stairs, kept my hand off the railing, and stepped out into the lobby where the mailboxes looked untouched, like normal life had simply paused. Outside, the air felt wrong. Not apocalyptic, not dramatic, just empty. The street was mostly clear, but not in a peaceful way. It was clear, like a building after closing, when you can still smell people but the sound is gone. I moved fast, head down, staying near parked cars for cover, listening for anything that didn't belong. Far off, sirens wailed and then cut out abruptly, as if someone had unplugged them. I headed toward the industrial district because that's where the spaces were. That's where the yards and fenced lots and utility corridors lived. Downtown was glass and crowds. Suburbs were houses full of unknowns. The industrial edge was ugly, but it was honest. I crossed under an overpass and felt the temperature drop. The concrete held the cold like a cellar. Graffiti covered the columns in bright colors that looked almost cheerful now. A shopping cart lay on its side in the gutter like someone had abandoned it mid-thought. I kept moving. My plan wasn't a plan, not yet. It was a direction, toward the place I remembered from a job 2 years ago, a client who'd asked us to run a fiber line near a rail spur for security cameras. That job had taken me along the perimeter of a rail yard I'd never really paid attention to before. Big yard, multiple tracks, old control building near the center, a web of signal masts and junction boxes, the kind of place that was designed to keep things moving without thinking. If the world was breaking, a place like that might still have hidden spaces. I didn't think of it as a shelter at first. I thought of it as cover. I reached the yard's outer fence just as the day started to tilt towards evening. And that's when I saw the first real sign that the freight stoppage wasn't just a logistics problem. A locomotive sat on a siding track, angled wrong, its front end off the rail by a foot, like it had stepped out of line and couldn't step back. Behind it, a string of cars leaned inward, not fully toppled, but derailed enough to look like a train had tried to bend. There were no crews, no trucks, no flashing maintenance lights, no orange vests. Just steel. Silent. The yard was a maze of choke points now. Derailed cars created walls. A stalled locomotive blocked a switch. Containers sat stacked too high like a half-finished skyline. And there were people. Not many, but enough to make my skin tighten. They moved between the cars, slow, pausing, turning their heads at nothing, then drifting again. Some wore work shirts, some wore sweatpants. One had a bright reflective vest that caught the last light of the sun and made them look like a warning sign. They weren't screaming, they weren't running. They were just wrong. I crouched behind a concrete barrier and watched. A distant sound came from inside the yard. A hollow bang, then another, then silence. The infected nearby didn't react like normal people. Some turned toward it, then stopped, as if their brains had shorted out mid-decision. Noise mattered. Vibration mattered. The yard was full of metal that could carry sound like a drum. I looked for a way in that didn't involve climbing the fence in open view. Along the perimeter, I found an old service gate with a chain lock that looked newer than it should have. Someone had tried to secure it, or someone had tried to keep something in. The padlock was cheap. I could have forced it, but the snap would be loud. Instead, I walked the fence line until I found what I was hoping for. A sagging section behind a line of scrub trees, where the ground had eroded under the lower mesh. Just enough space to slide through if you didn't mind dirt. I checked the yard again, then dropped to my stomach and wriggled under the fence, tool bag first, boots scraping in the gravel. On the other side, I lay still and listened. Nothing close. No footsteps. No sudden breaths. I got up, brushed dirt off my jacket, and moved deeper into the yard, keeping low, using the derailed cars like cover. The control building was where I remembered it. 2 stories. Concrete base, brick upper level, windows dark. It sat near a cluster of switch machines and signal masts, a place where someone once watched the whole yard like a chessboard. Now, it looked abandoned in a way that wasn't just closed. It looked like it had been left quickly. The door on the ground level was ajar. That should have been a warning. It was. I still went in. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and dust, But under that was something else, an oily, metallic scent, like batteries that had been left to die. The hallway was narrow, lined with faded safety posters. Some had been torn down halfway, leaving curled paper like dead leaves. I moved slowly, scanning corners with my headlamp, keeping the light low. The building wasn't empty. Not in the way I meant. A chair lay on its side. A coffee cup sat on the floor, dried spill like a stain. A clipboard hung from a hook, blank. A wall clock had stopped at a time that meant nothing now. I found a stairwell leading down. I hadn't known there was a basement, but it made sense. Control buildings often had cable runs, equipment rooms, relay racks, and access to conduits that snaked out beneath the yard. The stairwell smelled colder, damp. I started down, each step carefully placed. At the bottom, a heavy steel door stood open, and beyond it I saw what I'd hoped for. A surface corridor, concrete walls, ceiling low, cables running along trays, thick bundles disappearing into the dark like roots. This was the nervous system of the yard. And it was quiet. Quiet enough that I could hear my own breathing, which suddenly sounded too loud. I stepped into the corridor and closed the steel door as gently as I could. It didn't latch fully, but it settled into place with a soft clunk. I kept moving. The corridor split. One branch leading toward what looked like an equipment room, another narrowing into a tunnel that ran under the yard. I chose the tunnel. It was barely tall enough for me to stand without scraping my head. The walls were lined with cable conduits and occasional junction boxes. Some boxes were open, wires cut and hanging like veins. Others were sealed, labeled with numbers that meant something to someone once. I recognized a few things: old signal power cabinets, a rack mount frame that might have held communication equipment, and, farther along, a room with a metal rack that looked like it used to hold battery banks. The racks were empty now. Whatever had been here had been removed on purpose. That was my first clue that the yard hadn't just shut down. It had been stripped. Not looted, not vandalized. Stripped like a facility being decommissioned under pressure. I kept going until I found a spot that felt defensible. A small side chamber with a narrow entrance, a concrete ledge, and a heavy cable bundle that ran overhead like a thick rope bridge. There was a grated drain in the floor and a faint trickle of water somewhere behind the wall. I set my tool bag down and sat on the ledge, trying to slow my breathing. Above me, I could feel the yard even through the concrete. Not sound exactly, more like a faint sense of weight. Steel on steel. Massive shapes resting. I let myself exhale. For the first time all day, I was out of sight. Then I heard the first vibration. A deep, irregular thud, like something heavy had fallen against metal. It traveled down through the concrete and into my bones. Then another. Closer. I froze. Headlamp off now, darkness pressing in. The infected above were moving. Maybe they'd smelled something. Maybe they'd heard my fence scrape. Maybe it was random. But the yard was a soundboard, and everything carried. I waited, counting thuds in my head. 1, 2, 3. Then silence. I stayed still for a long time. When I finally dared to move, I took out my radio, turned the volume low, and scanned frequencies like I'd done during storms. Mostly static, a few snippets of voices clipped and distorted too far away to make sense. Then, faint and clear enough to raise the hair on my arms, a voice came through on a local channel. Repeat, do not approach. Then static swallowed it. I leaned back against the wall, eyes closed, and tried to build a plan. Water, food, safety, exit routes. My supplies were for a day, maybe 2. I couldn't stay underground forever. But for tonight, the tunnel was my shelter. I slept in fits, waking every time the yard above made a noise that traveled down the concrete like a warning. At some point, I heard something that wasn't just thuds. A long scrape like metal dragging, then a crash, then, faintly, a chorus of guttural sounds, not words, not screams, but something restless and hungry. I pressed my hands over my ears and waited for it to pass. When morning came, if you can call it morning underground, I checked my phone. No signal, battery low. I sat there and realized something that made my chest feel tight. I might not be able to go back the way I came, because the yard was awake now. I needed to understand what this place was, what routes it offered, and why it had been shut down in the first place. So I did what I always did when I didn't know something. I started exploring the system. The tunnel network wasn't huge, but it was more extensive than I expected. It wasn't a subway, it wasn't a hidden bunker. It was a practical, ugly grid built to move cables and maintain equipment without constantly digging up ballast and tracks. There were signal tunnels that ran under switch points. There were cable conduits that popped up into small access rooms with hatches leading to the surface. There were even old maintenance alcoves with shelves and rusted tools. In one room, I found a wall-mounted schematic behind cracked plastic. The paper was yellowed but legible. It was a map of the yard's control systems, track circuits, switch machines, signal blocks, power feeds. And in the corner, stamped in bold, was a label. Decommission Plan. Phase 2. Under that, handwritten in marker, someone had scrawled, "Do not enter South Conduit. Ground unstable." Hearing it again. I stared at those words longer than I should have. Hearing it again. Not leak, not collapse, not animals. Something else. I pulled the map free carefully, folded it, and tucked it into my jacket. Then I heard a sound from the tunnel behind me. A soft clink. Not vibration from above, not distant thuds. A small, deliberate noise. Someone else was down here. I killed my headlamp and went still, pressing into the shadow of the room. The clink came again, closer. My throat tightened. I held my breath, listening for footsteps, for breathing. Then a whisper, so faint I almost thought it was my imagination. "Hello?" A human voice. I didn't answer right away. In this new world, trust was dangerous. But silence was dangerous too. I waited until I could make out a shape in the doorway. A person with a small flashlight beam pointed down, moving carefully. They were small, slim, wearing a hooded jacket and carrying a backpack that looked too heavy for them. They stopped just inside the room, sweeping their light across the floor, then up to the schematic frame I'd just disturbed. Their voice came again, shaky. "Please, I'm not sick. I heard someone moving." I stayed still another second, then spoke softly. "I'm here. Don't come closer." They froze. The flashlight beam jumped. Okay, I won't." I stepped out slowly, keeping my hands visible, my own headlamp still off. I didn't want to blind them or look aggressive. They were younger than me, maybe mid-20s. Their face was pale, smudged with dirt. Their eyes looked too big, like they hadn't slept. "My name's Ethan," I said. "What's yours?" "Lena," they whispered. "Lena Park." We stood there in the dim, two strangers in a concrete room under a dead rail yard, trying to decide if the other one was real. Lena's hands trembled slightly on the flashlight. "How long have you been down here?" I asked. "Since last night," she said. "I came in through, a hatch, near the west tracks. I was running. I didn't mean to end up here." "Did you see anyone else?" I asked. She shook her head, then swallowed. "I heard people above, not normal people." I nodded. "Yeah." She looked past me, eyes flicking to the schematic map. "Do you know this place?" "A little," I said. "Not really. I did a job nearby once. This control building. I remembered it. Lena exhaled slowly, as if that explanation gave her something to hold on to. I work at the university, she said, then corrected herself automatically like habits mattered. I was a graduate assistant, transportation engineering. We studied freight networks. Of course she did, I thought. Of course I'd meet someone under a rail yard who understood rail. It would have been funny in a different life. Okay, I said. Then you'll appreciate this. I pointed to the handwritten warning on the schematic. Someone wrote that, Lena said, stepping closer despite herself. She traced the words with her eyes. South conduit, ground unstable, hearing it again. What does that mean? I asked. She frowned. Could be sinkhole risk, old drainage issues, or... She stopped, then looked at me like she didn't want to say the next part. Or it could be something else. Like what? I asked. Lena swallowed. Sometimes they close facilities because of incidents they don't want to advertise. A derailment, hazardous material, structural failure, something that makes lawsuits. I thought of the stripped battery racks, the empty equipment mounts. Why would they strip it then? I asked. Why not just lock it and walk away? Lena's eyes flicked toward the tunnel again. Maybe they did lock it, she said, and someone reopened it. We both went quiet. Above us, the yard made a distant groan, metal shifting as something heavy leaned. The sound traveled down and made the concrete vibrate faintly. Lena flinched. Noise attracts them, I said, mostly to reassure her, but also to remind myself. We need to stay quiet. She nodded. We moved back toward my side chamber, our lights low, our steps measured. I showed her the ledge, the drain, the place where the tunnel widened enough to sit without feeling like you were being swallowed. We shared water, carefully rationing. I gave her a protein bar. She ate it like it was the first food she'd had in a week. Do you have anyone? I asked. Family? Lena's jaw tightened. My parents are in New Jersey. I don't know if the bridges are open. My phone stopped working. I nodded, understanding too well. My sister's across town, I said. Also, no signal. We sat in the dark, listening to the yard above. Every so often, the infected would bump into a car or scrape along a metal surface, and the vibration would roll through the concrete like distant thunder. Hours passed. Then, late in what I guessed was afternoon, we heard something different. A deep, rhythmic vibration. Not random impacts, not shuffling. A repeated even pulse. Thump, thump, thump. Lena's eyes went wide. Is that a locomotive? She whispered. I listened harder. It wasn't an engine, no rising pitch, no whine, no horn. Just heavy impacts, measured. Something's hitting something, I said. Regularly. Thump, thump, thump. Then a crack. Sharp enough to make dust fall from the ceiling. Lena sucked in a breath. Structural, she whispered. Something's giving way. I stood up, heart pounding, and looked down the tunnel toward the schematic room. If something collapses above, I said, it could crush a conduit or block our exit. We need to know where that's happening. Lena hesitated. You want to go toward it? I don't want to, I said, but I also don't want to be buried alive. We moved, staying close to the wall, lights off most of the time, using brief flashes to navigate. The tunnel led toward the south branch, the one marked with the warning. The sound grew louder. Thump, thump, thump. Then a long, dragging scrape, like something heavy being pulled. When we reached an intersection, the air changed. It smelled wetter, more stagnant, and there was a faint odor under it, like rotten wood and old metal. Lena stopped, eyes fixed on the tunnel ahead. This is the south conduit," she whispered. I checked the map in my jacket with my headlamp shielded by my hand. The lines matched. "Ground unstable," I muttered. Another crack echoed. Dust drifted down like a gray snow. Lena grabbed my sleeve. "Ethan?" I looked at her. Her face was tight, focused in a way that made her look older. "We shouldn't be here," she said. "If it collapses, we're done." "I know," I said, "but something's already collapsing." We edged forward anyway because fear doesn't stop you when the alternative is ignorance. The south conduit narrowed and sloped slightly downward. Water trickled along a shallow channel in the floor. The walls looked older here, more patched, more stained. Some sections had been reinforced with metal braces bolted into concrete. Others showed cracks filled with old sealant. Then we reached a point where the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. And that's where we found the reason the yard had been shut down. The chamber was a utility vault, wide with thick concrete pillars and a ceiling reinforced with steel beams. Cable trays ran overhead, but many were empty or cut. On the far wall, a massive conduit, big enough for a person to crawl through, had been sealed with a concrete plug that looked newer than everything around it. And the plug wasn't intact. It had a fracture line down the center, and each time the rhythmic thump happened, the fracture widened slightly, then settled. Something on the other side was pushing. Thump, thump, thump. Lena's hand went to her mouth. "What is that?" she whispered, barely audible. I didn't answer because my brain was trying to stay rational and failing. On the wall near the plug, I saw markings. Faded hazard striping and an old metal sign bolted crookedly. The letters were scratched, but I could read enough. Restricted access. Subsurface stabilization zone. Authorized personnel only. Below that, another sign, smaller, newer. Handwritten, laminated, taped to the wall. If you hear it, leave it. Do not stay to watch. Lena's breathing was shallow. Thump, thump, thump. The crack widened again, and a tiny chunk of concrete fell out, hitting the floor with a sharp tap. That sound, small as it was, traveled through the tunnel. Above us, almost immediately we heard movement. Faster, more reactive. The infected responded to vibrations like they were wired to them. Lena grabbed my arm harder. "We have to go," she whispered. I nodded, backing away. Then the thumping stopped. For a second, there was silence so complete it felt like pressure. And in that silence, we heard something else. A low, distant hum, not mechanical, not electrical, but resonant, like air moving through a long, hollow space. Lena's eyes filled with panic. "Ethan," she said, voice breaking. I don't think that's the infected." I didn't know what it was, but I knew this. A place doesn't get shut down, for reasons no one explained, unless the explanation would scare people. We retreated quickly, as quietly as we could, but the infected above had already been stirred. Their movements became more frequent, more chaotic. Metal clanged. Something fell. The yard was waking up in an ugly way. Back in the safer tunnel, we paused to listen. The rhythmic thump didn't return, but the hum did, faint, lingering, like a memory you couldn't shake. Lena leaned against the wall, eyes closed, trying not to cry. "We can't stay here," she whispered. "I know," I said. But leaving meant going back into the yard. And the yard, now full of derailed steel and restless infected, was a maze designed to trap anything that moved. We needed a way out that didn't put us in open ground. I unfolded the schematic again. There were surface hatches marked along the conduits, small maintenance access points that came up near signal cabinets, switch machines, and utility poles. If we could reach one on the edge of the yard, we might be able to crawl out under cover. Lena pointed at one with a shaking finger. "That one," she whispered. "Northwest. It comes up near the old communications hut. That's close to the perimeter fence." I nodded. "That's our exit." We started moving, slow and careful. As we walked, I couldn't stop thinking about the sealed conduit and the warning signs, about the empty battery racks, about the stripped equipment. This wasn't a yard that had simply aged out. This was a yard that had been abandoned like someone wanted to forget it existed. And now, in the middle of a collapse no one could explain, it had become the only place that made sense to hide. We reached the northwest branch as the vibrations above grew louder. More impacts, more scraping, more chaotic movement. At one point, something massive shifted overhead, and the tunnel ceiling dusted us like flour. Lena coughed silently into her sleeve, eyes wide. "Quiet," I mouthed, more for both of us than as an instruction. The hatch access room was small, with a ladder bolted into the wall leading up to a metal plate overhead. The plate had a handle and a latch that looked old but functional. I tested it gently. It didn't budge. Of course it didn't. Rust. Years. Maybe deliberate sealing. I pulled my pry bar from my bag, wrapped the tip in electrical tape to muffle the metal-on-metal sound, and inserted it carefully into the seam. I applied pressure slowly, listening for any squeal. The hatch creaked anyway, a tiny protest. Above, the yard responded. Footsteps, shuffling, the scrape of someone bumping against a car. Lena's face tightened, but she held still. I paused, waited for the movement above to drift away, then tried again. This time the latch gave with a soft pop. I stopped breathing for a second. Nothing immediate happened. I lifted the hatch a fraction, just enough to peek. Daylight stabbed down, making the dusty air sparkle. I saw ballast stones, a patch of weeds, the base of a signal mast painted dull gray, and beyond that the side of an old building, maybe the communications hut Lena had mentioned. No infected in the immediate view. I lifted the hatch a bit more, slowly. A distant clank echoed, but it wasn't close. I looked at Lena. "You go first," I whispered. She shook her head hard. "No, you." "I'm bigger," I said. "If this sticks, I'll have more leverage. Go." She hesitated, then nodded, climbing the ladder carefully. She pushed the hatch the rest of the way with her shoulder and slid out onto the ballast like a cat, quiet and fast. I followed, emerging into the yard's thin, gray daylight. The air smelled like cold steel and dust. The yard around us looked like a disaster scene frozen in time. Derailed cars, twisted couplers. A locomotive tilted like it was bowing. We stayed low, moving behind the communications hut, which was a small concrete building with a steel door and boarded windows. Someone had spray-painted a warning across the door in red. "Do not enter. Not safe." Everything here had warnings. Everything here had been shouting at people to stay away long before the outbreak. Lena pointed toward the perimeter fence, about 50 yards away, partly hidden by stacked pallets and a line of old equipment cabinets. We moved, crouched, using the yard's clutter as cover. Halfway there, a loud crash rang out from the center of the yard, metal collapsing. A chain reaction of movement. The infected reacted immediately, converging toward the noise like iron filings to a magnet. Their movements weren't intelligent, but they were purposeful in the simplest way. Sound meant something. That crash gave us a window. We reached the fence line and found the same sagging section I'd entered through. I pushed the mesh up, and Lena slid under first. I followed, boots scraping, breath held. On the outside, we lay in the scrub and listened. The yard behind us churned with a distant noise, but nothing close. We got up and moved away from the fence, heading toward the tree line, then toward the service road that ran parallel to the industrial strip. Only when we were far enough that the yard sounds felt faint did we stop. Lena leaned against a tree, eyes closed, shaking. I sat on the ground, tool bag between my feet, and stared back at the rail yard. From this angle, it looked almost peaceful, like a model train set abandoned by a bored kid. But I knew what was under it. The tunnels, the sealed conduit, the warnings, the hum. Whatever had been pushing against that cracked plug. Lena opened her eyes and looked at me. "What do we do now?" she asked. I swallowed, tasting dust. "We find somewhere safer," I said. "Somewhere we can control. Somewhere we can get water." "And the thing under the yard?" she asked, voice small. I looked back at the derailed cars, the control building, the silent signal masts. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I know this. That yard was abandoned for a reason. And if we stay near it, we might learn what that reason was the hard way." Lena nodded slowly, then pulled her backpack straps tighter like she was bracing for impact. We started walking. Behind us, the rail yard groaned again, as if the ground itself was shifting, settling, remembering. And for a moment, just a moment, I thought I heard that low hum carry on the wind, faint but persistent, like something below the surface had finally noticed the world above was falling apart, and it was waiting. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.